20% of the entire world's oil supply flows through a single stretch of water, only 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. And back in February of 2026, Iran did something no nation had ever actually attempted before. It didn't just threaten to close the Strait of Hormuz, it actually did it. And what the United States did in response wasn't just a military operation. It became one of the most dramatic, expensive, and consequential naval confrontations in modern history, one that pushed oil prices past $126 a barrel, sparked a genuine global energy crisis, and ended with America doing something almost nobody expected: seizing Iranian ships by force, disabling tankers with precision airstrikes, and putting the entire Persian Gulf under what Donald Trump himself called total American control. Let me walk you through exactly how this happened, because the story of what unfolded in the Strait of Hormuz over these past several months is honestly one of the wildest, most underreported sagas of this entire war. And by the time you understand the full picture, you'll see exactly why this single waterway became the most dangerous flashpoint on the planet. It all started on February 28, 2026, when the United States and Israel launched a massive surprise military campaign against Iran, striking military and government targets across the country and, in one of the most stunning moves of the entire operation, assassinating Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, along with several other senior officials. Iran's response was immediate, and it targeted the one piece of leverage Tehran has held over the global economy for decades. Within hours, Iran shut down the Strait of Hormuz completely, blocking the passage that normally carries about a fifth of the entire world's oil and liquefied natural gas supply. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps broadcast direct warnings over marine radio to every ship in the area, stating flatly that no vessel would be allowed to pass. Britain's Royal Navy responded by telling shipping companies that, while the closure technically wasn't legally binding under international law, safety could no longer be guaranteed, which was diplomatic language for stay out unless you want to find out the hard way. Several ships stayed in port. Others simply turned around and left. By March 4th, the IRGC was publicly boasting that its Navy had achieved what it called complete control of the strait. Here's what made this moment so significant, and why analysts had actually been quietly warning about exactly this scenario for years before it happened. In the private briefings leading up to those initial February strikes, America's own Joint Chiefs of Staff had specifically warned President Trump that attacking Iran could prompt Tehran to close the strait entirely. That warning turned out to be exactly right. And once it happened, the economic shockwave was immediate and brutal. Oil prices, which had been sitting around $65 a barrel before the war began, started climbing rapidly, eventually soaring well past $100, an increase that ripples through literally every part of the global economy, from the price of gasoline at your local pump to the cost of shipping goods across the planet. Some Iran-approved ships, mostly oil tankers heading to China and India, were still allowed through, occasionally with Iranian military escort. But Iran made it very clear this was a privilege it controlled entirely, and it even reportedly began charging some vessels tolls as high as $2 million just to pass through waters that had always been considered international. So the United States decided it wasn't going to negotiate its way through this one. It was going to force the issue militarily. On March 12th, Trump announced that the U.S. Navy would begin escorting oil tankers through the strait as soon as possible. But the real turning point came on March 19th, when the United States launched a full-scale aerial campaign specifically designed to reopen the strait by force, targeting the Iranian naval assets and drone systems that were actively enforcing the blockade. This wasn't a symbolic gesture. This was a serious military operation. CENTCOM announced it had used multiple GBU-72 bombs, 5,000-pound precision-guided bunker busters, specifically targeting underground missile silos built into the Iranian coastline near the strait. These weapons are designed to punch straight through layers of solid rock and reinforced concrete, and they were used to destroy hardened underground bunkers where Iran had been storing large numbers of cruise missiles and unused anti-ship weapons. Exactly the kind of arsenal Iran would need to keep threatening commercial shipping in the strait long term. At the same time, General Dan Kane announced that the United States was deploying A-10 Thunderbolt aircraft, the famous tank-killing jets built around a massive rotary cannon, specifically to hunt down and destroy Iranian fast attack boats, the small, speedy vessels Iran had been using to harass and intimidate tankers. Alongside them, Boeing AH-64 Apache attack helicopters were brought in specifically to handle the one-way attack drones Iran had been launching at shipping traffic in the strait. This was a genuinely comprehensive military response. Air power specifically tailored to counter every single tool Iran had been using to enforce its blockade, from underground missile stockpiles to small speedboats to explosive drones. And then, on March 26th, something happened that sent an unmistakable message straight to Tehran. Israel confirmed it had assassinated Alireza Tangsiri, Iran's top naval commander. the man directly overseeing the entire blockade operation in the Strait of Hormuz. Israeli Defense Minister Israel Katz didn't mince words about why Tangsiri had been targeted, calling him directly responsible for what Katz described as the terrorist act of bombing and blocking the strait. American Admiral Brad Cooper offered his own blunt assessment of the killing, saying simply that it made the region safer. Iranian authorities confirmed Tangsiri's death, but in the days that followed, Iran showed no signs of backing down. If anything, they doubled down. On March 27th, Iran reported that its forces had successfully blocked 2 Chinese ships attempting to enter the strait. A genuinely bold move considering how much Iran depends on China as one of its few remaining major oil customers. The situation kept escalating through late March and into April, with real dangerous incidents piling up on both sides. On March 30th, a container ship called the Express Rome, flying under a Liberian flag, reported 2 projectiles splashing into the water dangerously close by, just 22 nautical miles off the coast of Saudi Arabia. No injuries, no damage that time, but a clear warning shot in every sense of the phrase. The very next day, a Kuwaiti oil tanker anchored at the port of Dubai was struck directly by an Iranian drone, causing a fire on board. On April 1st, airstrikes hit Hengam Island, a strategically important piece of territory sitting right in the strait, causing 7 injuries, one of them critical. By mid-April, the United States decided that airstrikes alone weren't enough. On April 13th, following the collapse of ceasefire talks held in Islamabad, President Trump ordered a full naval blockade of Iran itself. This wasn't just about reopening the strait for other countries anymore. It was about directly strangling Iran's own ability to move ships in or out of its own ports. Within the first 24 hours, CENTCOM reported an absolutely massive deployment, more than 10,000 American personnel, over a dozen warships and dozens of aircraft, all actively enforcing the blockade. And in a detail that tells you just how effective that show of force was, not a single vessel attempted to breach it on day one. 6 commercial ships actually complied peacefully and turned back toward Iranian ports on their own. But peace didn't last long. On April 14th, at least 4 Iran-linked vessels tried crossing the strait anyway, according to public ship tracking data, before apparently being intercepted by American forces and turning back. The following day, CENTCOM posted directly on social media that an Iranian-flagged cargo vessel had tried to evade the blockade entirely. And then, on April 19th, the standoff crossed a line that hadn't been crossed in this entire conflict up to that point. American forces conducted their first direct seizure of an Iranian ship. The USS Spruance, a Navy destroyer, along with Marines from the 31st Marine Expeditionary Unit, physically boarded and seized an Iranian-flagged vessel called the Tuska as it attempted to break through the blockade. This wasn't a warning shot or a diversion order anymore. This was the United States Navy physically taking control of an Iranian ship on the open water, the kind of action that, in almost any other era, would itself be treated as a serious act of war. Iran's government reacted with fury, and their own rhetoric only escalated further. Iran described the American blockade and the seizure of its vessels using deliberately provocative language, calling it acts of piracy and maritime theft. Iran's Speaker of Parliament, Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, who was also serving as Tehran's chief negotiator in the ongoing talks with Washington, called the American blockade both ignorant and foolish, and made Iran's position bluntly clear. If Iran's own ships were going to be blocked, then no one else was going to be allowed through the strait either. On April 18th, after a brief window where Iran had actually agreed to reopen the strait as part of a broader regional ceasefire arrangement tied to a separate truce in Lebanon, Tehran reversed course completely and closed the waterway again, specifically citing America's refusal to lift its own naval blockade of Iranian ports as the justification. That reversal triggered one of the most dangerous stretches of the entire crisis. Iranian forces opened fire directly on ships attempting to pass through the strait. The United Kingdom's Maritime Trade Operations Agency reported a tanker coming under fire from what were identified as IRGC-linked gunboats. India, deeply invested in this waterway, given how much of its own oil imports pass through it, summoned Iran's ambassador in New Delhi after 2 Indian-flagged ships came under direct fire, expressing what its government called deep concern. Lloyd's List, one of the most respected maritime tracking organizations in the world, reported that traffic through the strait had essentially ground to a complete halt following that wave of attacks. Then, in one of the most tragic and consequential incidents of this entire standoff, on a Wednesday in June, CENTCOM disabled a vessel identified as the Palau-flagged MT Setabello, which had been attempting to transport oil directly out of Iran in violation of the blockade. According to CENTCOM's own public statement, an American aircraft fired precision munitions directly into the ship's engine room, specifically targeting the vessel's propulsion system after the crew had repeatedly ignored direct orders from American forces to stop and comply. 3 Indian sailors aboard that vessel were killed in the strike. India's foreign ministry issued a formal condemnation of the attack. This was, without question, one of the most serious and deadly single incidents of the entire blockade, a moment where America's enforcement of this economic siege had crossed from disabling ships and seizing cargo into directly causing the deaths of civilian sailors from a country that wasn't even a formal party to the underlying conflict. By this point, the numbers behind this entire operation had become genuinely staggering. CENTCOM's own reporting showed that American forces had disabled at least 8 vessels, redirected over 130 others away from Iranian ports, while still allowing more than 40 ships carrying humanitarian aid to pass through under exemption. President Trump publicly claimed the blockade was costing Iran $500 million every single day, while the Department of Defense offered its own independent estimate, calculating that Iran had lost close to $5 billion in total oil revenue by the beginning of May alone. Trump didn't stop at economic pressure either. At one point, he directly ordered the U.S. Navy to, in his own words, shoot and kill any boat caught laying mines in the strait, adding that American minesweepers clearing the waterway would operate, quote, at a tripled-up level going forward. He went even further rhetorically, declaring at one point that America had achieved total control over the Strait of Hormuz, stating plainly that no ship could enter or leave without direct U.S. Navy approval, describing the waterway as, in his words, sealed up tight until Iran was ready to make a deal. This wasn't purely an American operation either, even though Washington absolutely led it. As the crisis dragged on, Trump publicly called on other nations that depend on oil flowing through Hormuz to step up and help defend the passage militarily. The response from traditional American allies was, frankly, not what Washington was hoping for. Several major NATO countries, including Germany, Spain, Italy, Estonia, the United Kingdom, Australia, South Korea, and Japan, along with the European Union as a whole, publicly declined to commit their own forces, citing either unclear strategic objectives or general reluctance to get pulled deeper into a war that wasn't originally their fight. Trump didn't take that rejection quietly. He lashed out at NATO directly, calling the alliance's members cowards and declaring bluntly that without the United States, NATO was nothing more than what he called a paper tiger. Not every ally said no, though. The United Arab Emirates, sitting right on the doorstep of this crisis, declared its willingness to actively join a U.S.-led military effort to secure the strait. Britain eventually committed real assets, too, announcing in May that it would deploy drones, fighter aircraft, and an actual Royal Navy warship as part of a broader international mission specifically focused on protecting commercial shipping through Hormuz. The United Kingdom went further still, hosting a major international conference in late April that brought together representatives from 50 different countries specifically to hammer out a coordinated plan for reopening the strait for good. Even China, which has historically stayed relatively quiet on direct military confrontations in this region, weighed in publicly. During a phone call with Saudi Arabia's Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman in late April, Chinese leader Xi Jinping stated plainly that the Strait of Hormuz needed to remain open to normal navigation, calling it something firmly in the common interest of every country in the region and the broader international community. That statement mattered enormously because China happens to be one of the largest buyers of Iranian oil on the planet. And if even Beijing was publicly pushing for the strait to stay open, it told you just how much economic pain this closure was inflicting far beyond just the countries directly involved in the fighting. The human and economic toll of this entire saga was genuinely enormous by the time things finally started moving toward resolution. Experts were openly warning about the risk of a full-blown global recession triggered specifically by the energy crunch this closure had caused. War risk insurance premiums for ships transiting the strait had spiked dramatically in the lead up to the crisis, and for the largest oil tankers, that increase alone added roughly $250,000 in extra insurance costs for a single trip through the waterway. Oil prices, which again had been sitting around $65 a barrel before any of this started, eventually peaked as high as $126 a barrel during the worst stretches of the closure, nearly double the pre-war price. A shock that hit consumers, businesses, and entire national economies across the globe, regardless of whether their country had any direct involvement in the underlying conflict at all. So how did this entire standoff finally get resolved? After months of strikes, blockades, seizures, and genuinely dangerous close calls on the water, diplomacy eventually managed to catch up with the military pressure campaign. On June 14th, President Trump and Iranian officials announced a formal agreement to end the war entirely and reopen the Strait of Hormuz for good. Trump confirmed he had personally authorized lifting the American naval blockade as part of that deal. Just days later, on June 17th, Trump and Iran's President Masoud Pezeshkian formally signed a memorandum of understanding to officially end the war. And in a detail that honestly sounds almost too dramatic to be real, that signing happened during a dinner with French President Emmanuel Macron at the Palace of Versailles, immediately following a G7 summit, the kind of symbolic, historic setting that Trump has always been drawn to for major diplomatic moments. On June 18th, CENTCOM formally announced the complete removal of the naval blockade against Iranian ports. Even after everything, though, Iran couldn't fully hide the toll this entire episode had taken on its own economy. On June 30th, Iranian officials publicly admitted something that spoke volumes about just how effective the American pressure campaign had actually been. Tehran acknowledged, in plain terms, that it had simply been unable to export oil at all during the height of the American blockade of its ports. Think about that admission for a moment. Iran spent months trying to weaponize its control over one of the world's most important waterways, using it as leverage against the United States and the entire global economy. And by the time the dust settled, it was Iran's own economy that had absorbed the deepest, most undeniable damage, unable to sell the one resource its entire national budget has always depended on most. When you step back and look at the full arc of this story, from Iran's initial closure of the Strait in February, through months of airstrikes, assassinated commanders, seized ships, disabled tankers, dead sailors, and a genuinely global economic shockwave, all the way to a formal peace agreement signed at the Palace of Versailles in June, you start to understand exactly why this confrontation stunned so many people who were watching it unfold in real time. Iran tried to use its geography, one of the most strategically important stretches of water on the entire planet, as a weapon against the United States and the global economy at large, and the American response wasn't cautious or restrained. It was an absolutely full-spectrum campaign: precision bunker-busting airstrikes, targeted assassinations of enemy commanders, a full naval blockade involving over 10,000 personnel, direct ship seizures on the open water, and ultimately, a level of sustained economic pressure severe enough to force Iran's own government to publicly admit defeat on the exact battlefield it had chosen for itself. That's the real story behind the Strait of Hormuz crisis of 2026, a story that started with one country trying to hold a fifth of the world's oil supply hostage, and ended with the United States demonstrating, in the most direct and forceful way imaginable, exactly what it's willing to do to keep that waterway open, no matter the cost, no matter how many countries said no along the way, and no matter how long it actually took to finish the job. If this deep dive into exactly how this crisis actually unfolded caught you off guard as much as it caught me when I first started researching it, let me know in the comments which part of this whole saga genuinely surprised you the most. Because there were honestly several moments in this timeline that I think most people watching the news at the time completely missed. And if you made it all the way through this one with me, do me a favor and share it with someone who still doesn't fully understand just how close this entire situation came to spiraling into something even bigger. Because stories like this one deserve way more attention than they actually got while it was happening. We'll keep tracking exactly what comes next for the region, so stick around, because this story is honestly far from over.